Goobs! I need your help, buddy. Anyway, you're a chemist, right? So how do I bring old, dried paint back to life?
Dropper bottle. Squirty bottle.
No, I'm not.
The finest in bamboo mixing sticks.
How would that help?
Irresponsible chemicals.
You sure?
Refreshments. Breaks.
Okay, now you're just naming everything on your desk.
Strength. Endurance.
You're just messing with me right now, aren't you?
Cell phone radiation. Microwave radiation. Gamma radiation.
All right. Thanks, Goobs. This has been enlightening. "17 years ago, I intended to start miniature painting. I collected some awesome models that were the new hotness from the local game store, and I went on eBay and I bought a used copy of the big paint set that Games Workshop offered at the time. And although I never actually got around to painting a single model in those days, somehow I held on to all the paints as well as the models. I lost the box along the way, but when I started to paint for real a few years ago, I decided I already have my paints. And unfortunately, they had turned out to all be a dry, nasty mess. So back into the closet they went, and I don't know why I didn't throw them away. I recall thinking that I should. But since I didn't, maybe we should see if we can actually save these paints, all 64 of them, and try them out on a brand new, awesome vampire model. Today's video is brought to us by Iaian Lovecraft's FEYWOOD. This is a campaign live now on My Mini Factory crowdfunding with a ton of models and terrain bits for you to 3D print at home. The models in FEYWOOD give me this nostalgic feeling of fantasy miniatures of old with a new twist. And the terrain. You got to see this terrain. This looks like it came straight from a high-budget Hollywood movie set, straight out of a fantasy setting. Oh, and what's even crazier is that if you go out and visit the page, you can actually download free models. He's giving you samples for free that you can download and print with no strings attached, just to check out the high-quality models that he produces. So whether you want to add to an amazing collection of D&D miniatures and terrain for your weekly game, or maybe you want to impress all of your friends at the Wargaming Club by showing them the amazing full table of terrain you can create, or maybe you're like me, and you just don't want these things to pass you by because you know you'll have a future idea where this will make a wonderful diorama or painting project. Whatever the case may be, go over to Iaian Lovecraft's FEYWOOD in the link below and check it out. As you can see, when I said these paints were dried up, I meant it. If I have any hope to bring this rock-hard brick of pigment back to life, I'll need some serious help. A mortar and pestle seemed like the logical place to start. I smash up the pigment as much as I can before adding anything to it. I want the chunks broken up so we can have as much surface area exposed as possible. So when I do introduce water and medium back in, it can be incorporated easier. Now, I'm no chemist, but what I think will work well, and we're going to try right now, is a 50-50 mix of Liquitex matte medium and water. The medium will act as a binder for our pigments, and the water will help us get a silky smooth consistency in theory. It was at this point when I felt I was doing something oddly familiar, and I was also getting really hungry. Then it dawned on me. This golden yellow paint is the same color and consistency as the cheese powder you mix in when you make Kraft mac and cheese dinner. Or just Kraft dinner if you're from Canada. The final paint product from this mortar and pestle experiment is great. It's smooth, opaque, and the right consistency for miniature paint. But there's some big problems as well. I have 64 paints to revive, and this took a lot of time. It also creates a bunch of wasted paint, and cleaning up this mortar and pestle each time is something I have no desire to do. So instead of taking 3 months to replicate this on each color with the mortar and pestle, I'm going to take what I learned and apply it to the paints. See, they all have a screw top on the lid. And so I could just simply unscrew the lid for each paint and I can work them back in the same process that I did with the mortar and pestle. And luckily, not all the paints are as far gone as that mac and cheese yellow was. But most of them were very far gone, either completely dried or a very thick sludge consistency. But by smashing up the dried pigment and adding water and medium, it would start to come back to life slowly. I mixed things as best that I could, and I let the paint sit for 24 hours and then repeated the process. This allowed all of the moisture and medium to work back into the pigment over time. Many of these paints, I had to repeat this process for 3, 4, or 5 days, but eventually they came back to life. And not all the paints did get fully incorporated, and we're gonna run into a nasty little train wreck with that later, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, let's find out if mixing and spending all that time bringing these 63 paints back to life will actually work out for the best on a model. A smart person would have tested the mac and cheese yellow after the mortar and pestle technique before replicating it 63 more times. I'm not a smart man. I'll start by painting our undead skin of our female vampiress here. I love this shadow gray. It spoke to me immediately as our darkest shadow tone for the skin. It's nice and cool and vibrant at the same time. So here's our first big test. To my surprise, this paint went on smooth and silky just like it was straight from the factory. There's no way that I would have known that this paint was dry just a few days prior. And since it only took 2 thin coats to apply our base tone, I immediately started working up our flesh. I like to work flesh from dark to light. So we have our darkest shadow, and I'm adding in rotting flesh, which just seems obvious as a choice if you're painting a vampire. And spoiler alert, but for this entire video, I'm not going to be futzing around to try to create perfectly smooth blends. I'm more focused on making sure that I have the right balance between shadow, midtone, and highlight so each surface feels realistic. And once I start adding pure rotting flesh to the highlights, I'm really happy with how these 2 colors work together for our undead skin tone. The tint of green in the highlights are particularly cool. I'm feeling like the skin is missing a bit of depth of color, but I often wait until I've painted more areas of the model before I make a decision on if I need to add additional color depth and what color would look best. I envision the cloth of our vampiress to not be the center of attention, but I still want it to meld in to feel like a cohesive piece with the rest of the model. And since we have a bluish skin tone and I have a plan for the armor later, I'm going to go with the complementary color of orange. We'll go with a rusty, desaturated, almost dusty looking orange by the time we're all done here. To give the cloth a feeling of texture from the very first base coat, I use a rough stippling motion. I stab the model with the tip of the brush, creating a regular texture with the paint. Now it's important to use an old or cheap brush for this, as it will damage the tip. And I use cheap synthetic brushes. If the bristles are spread out throughout this process, it's actually a helpful thing. So every time I jab the model, it creates multiple dots instead of just a single one. A quick tip if you want to try this technique at home, make sure you take off most of the paint from the brush before you begin touching the model with it. Maybe don't take as much off as you would if you were dry brushing, but if you have too much paint on this brush, it's going to create big blobs, not the small little dots and scratches that we're aiming for. And once you get this process down, you can just repeat it for your midtones and highlights, which is what I do with our terracotta color and eventually our khaki. I just work smaller and smaller areas, and so I create the volumes of the surface without a whole lot of effort. And when we get to our final highlights of pure khaki, I bust out my nice sable hair brush. Now for this stippling, we are just doing one dot at a time, and we are being very gentle with the brush so we don't ruin it like we did with the mashing of our base coats. This will bring us some final great highlights and create a nice contrast on our material and show the texture. Remember when I said not all the paints turned out as great as I thought they had back when I was mixing them? Well, Chaos Black was my biggest failure. It was a chalky and grainy mess. And when I put it on the palette, I was able to mix it in vigorously with other colors to get rid of most of that grain to make it usable. But basically, I ended up not using hardly any black on this model's paint job. I do think that with a few more days of mixing and adding more medium and water and letting it rehydrate, it would be back to fully normal or close to it. But I'll use it to create this dark turquoise color for the starter of the army anyway. And I use the same smash brush approach to applying the base coat of the armor as I did with the cloth. This color is so dark that having some hardly discernible variations over the black primer will only give it a bit more of a realistic feel to the surface. And I'm starting so dark because one of the main ways our eyes recognize a surface as metal is the large jumps between darkness and light. Once the base coat is down, I start blocking in the areas of the armor that would catch the most light. This can be the trickiest step in painting non-metallic metal. Because I'm not going for a highly reflective armor though, I'm making it a little bit easier on myself. And I'm not going to create too many bounce lights on these metal surfaces. So in addition to continuing the theme of not worrying about blends too well, I'm also not worried about having an even distribution of shadow, midtone, and highlight. That's something that is symbolic for metallics. They jump really quickly from really dark to really light, oftentimes with almost no midtone in between. Instead, I'm just trying to worry about, is this surface parallel to our light source, the sun in the sky? If it is, I'm going to make sure it's bright. If it's not parallel, I'm going to try to make sure it's very dark. The further you push the brightness, the more it will start to read to the eye as metal. So if you're thinking of trying out NMM, or you're not sure how to get better at it, the first advice I typically give is to make most of the surface either really, really dark or really, really bright. Now that I've got my armor and my cloth all painted, I can confirm that there's not enough depth of color on this skin. So there was something else I remembered I had back in that big box of Games Workshop paints, and I had put them somewhere else, and it dawned on me. They had a full set of inks, and we're going to try those out as well. So I thinned down my magenta, add a little bit of flushness to her skin, and I make sure I use a tiny brush and that I keep my camera out of focus so you can't actually see what I'm doing on this step. I try to remember that every time I'm going to add color depth with the glaze, whether it's ink or paint, that I'm always pushing the paint in towards the shadow, not pulling it up in towards the highlight. And I went to all that trouble to mix up that stupid mac and cheese yellow in my mortar and pestle at the very beginning of this project. So damned if I'm not going to use that color in some way. I decided we're going to make a nice, beautiful golden hilt to these fancy rapiers. Scorched brown and our craft golden yellow will be doing all the heavy lifting. And just like with our armor, our goal is to have very dark darks and very bright brights. I mix in more and more golden yellow to the scorched brown with each pass, keeping our highlights strong but not all over the place. If you highlight too much of the surface, it's just going to read as a yellow handle, not a gold handle. And for our final dots of highlights, we mix in our mac and cheese 50-50 with the bright Bad Moon yellow for a final look that kind of feels like a nice rich antique gold. And in case you're not sick of painting non-metallic metal by now, we're going to do one more quick thing, and that's how I can quickly pull out a cool looking sword blade with not a lot of effort. The tricky thing about swords is that they have a long flat surface, and it's kind of confusing to know where to put your highlights on that surface. In general, I like to just put one main bigger highlight on the blade, and then a few smaller ones at random locations. No patterns here, and don't make those quite as bright as your main one. How's that for a scientific explanation for you? And after our scratchy, non-blended highlights are brought onto our blade, we can pull it together with some glazes of yellow on the upward-facing surfaces to give the impression of a reflection from the sky, like the sun, and a little bit of blue from below to show the reflection coming from the earth in the cool stones below her. And as I was figuring out what colors to paint this vampiress's hair, I noticed something. The matte finish of this paint on this model was beautiful. In fact, Games Workshop paints typically are fairly satin, which can actually make it pretty difficult to record them on video because of the reflection of the lights that I'm painting under. But this stuff is so matte and smooth, and I just loved it. This matte medium must have done the trick. Now, if you wanted a bit more of a shine on your revitalized paint, you could use like 2 parts matte medium and 1 part satin medium, or 50-50 mix. But I love this as is. I want this volume of hair to be nice and dark, but dark hair still has highlights. One problem we often come across is how to highlight something like dark hair without just making it look lighter than it is by highlighting every strand of hair. So what I do is keep most of the hair quite dark and then just work around my halo around the top of the head and build the highlights there and a couple other important strands of note, and keep most of the hair dark, and then it will truly read as dark purple, almost black hair. And for our final step, we're going to work out this base quickly. We're just going to start with a basic dry brush of a mid-tone gray up to a bright gray to hit all those edges and details on the base. But as we know, bases aren't just shades of gray. They have wonderful richness and depth of color to them. So I went back and grabbed a couple of our inks that I hadn't yet used on the project and tried those out. I put a little green over here, a little sepia over here, a little flesh color over here. And that really added a bunch of depth and interest to the base without making it take over our center of attention, the vampire herself. So here she is. And what's the final verdict? Was this worth all the time it took to bring this paint back to life? Short answer, I would not do this with a mortar and a pestle unless I had 1 or 2 paints that I really loved and they were too far gone. This, I know I could bring them back and be okay with the bit of waste that I would create. But just being able to pick any of our paints off the rack and say it's not going to be too far gone and I have to just toss it if it gets gunky. That feeling is pretty cool, that we ourselves can bring any of our paints back to life and make them as good, or in this case, because of the matte finish, better than they were to begin with. Thanks for hanging out and subscribing so you know when my next video drops. You want to help me to make more of those videos? Well, there's a couple ways you can do it. First of all, you can check out my Patreon, where we have a bunch of bonus rewards for you, like my awesome Discord server where we can chat about mini painting and help each other improve, as well as talk about macaroni and cheese. Also, you can check out my affiliate links in the video description, where you spend no extra money to buy the hobby tools like the stuff that I used in this video today at no cost to you, and I get a slight kickback. And finally, you can check out my website, ninjon.net, and check out some cool merch. Maybe get yourself a t-shirt or a hoodie. So, until next time, be good to one another, and get out there and slay that gray. Are you like the mini painting Forrest Gump now? You ever blink? Hey, when are you gonna hook me up with more of them cat videos?
Chemtrails.
So it's shampoo, conditioner, simple green, in that order?
tracking devices.
All right, if I wanted to make dry ice mini paint, how do I do that?
That's what I'm talking about.